Hello, everybody, and welcome to the fourth episode of ListenIN with Sunaparanta. We're proud to have with us Vinayak Bharne, who is an award-winning urban designer and city planner based in Los Angeles, but with a very special connection to Goa, including being an alumnus of the Sharda Mandir School. We last had him with us to launch his books, I think last year, on heritage conservation and affordable housing. And today's event is titled Health and the City, Rethinking Urbanism. I will hand over now to Leandre to introduce Vinayak and begin the session.
Thank you, Ishita. Vinayak, it is a pleasure to welcome you. Vinayak Bharne is based in LA. He is a practicing architect, urban designer, city planner, author, professor of urbanism at the University of Southern California. His work ranges from satellite cities, new towns, affordable housing, conservation efforts in different parts of the world. Today's segment, Rethinking Urbanism, considers whether the pandemic can be turned into an opportunity to talk about environmental health in terms of a more symbiotic relationship between nature and us, and to think about nature as an intrinsic element to our cities. We begin this session with the lecture presentation by Vinayak, who will take us through various urban projects that he has been working on and in different contexts. Following this, we will begin an interaction where Vinayak will be in conversation with Ishita and myself. This discussion will be separated into 4 topics, namely reclaiming public space, the relationship between wildlife and the city, mobility and what are the present challenges, and finally, public health and urban planning. At the end of this discussion, we will be addressing questions from our audience. Vinayak, I invite you to begin.
Thank you, Ishita. Thank you, Leandre. Thank you, Nilima, and everyone at Sunaparanta for this invitation. And thank you all for joining. Master is going to sit here and tell you how cities are going to change, or the future is going to change. I mean, the frank answer is I don't know. But I will say that over the past 25 years, I have had the pleasure of working with some very intelligent people in different parts of the world who taught me that there's another way of practice that is extremely urgent and timely, which is really about healing the damage, the insurmountable damage that we have done to our cities over the last 50, 60, or 100 years. And you know, when you work for 25 years, you fail many times. You get up, you try again. Sometimes you succeed, sometimes you don't. But amidst all these failures and successes, you gather a body of thought. And that is what I want to share with you today. So I'm just trying to preface this because I want you all to understand that the tone of this talk comes from the root of modesty, not authority. And I encourage you to take it this way so we can have a very frank discussion and that I can learn as much from you as hopefully some of the takeaways that you all have. So I wanted to talk today about health because I feel that, like so many of us, I think one of the things COVID-19 has done for us, it has brought back health to our psychological forefront. It has reminded us that amidst all our economic preoccupations, you know, there's an absolutely fundamental aspect of our existence, which is our health. But some points on what this means and its nexus to the city. I think the most important one, which we talked about in the book last year at Sunaparanta, is when you think about urban health, the first thing is that it's a direct relationship to environmental and social justice. And what does this actually mean? This is not a metaphorical discussion. Health is not a metaphorical word. It has direct implications to cities. For example, if you think of the contradiction that we take, you know, the areas that you and I don't like to hang out in, garbage dumps, landfills, and we throw them into areas where the people who live around these places have the least access to healthcare. So it's a contradiction of absolutely paramount proportions. And while you and I sit in our homes and we talk about these wonderful subjects, there are millions of people out there who don't have a home. So the idea of being at home, safe at home, doesn't apply to these people. The point I'm making is we live in grossly unjust cities. And unless we launch a campaign to really talk about what this means, we're not even beginning to talk about health. So that's number one. Number two, there's a confusion between health and wellness. You know, I married a health coach. My wife is a health coach 15 years ago. And through her, my perspectives on health began to change. Because if I talk to her about health, the way she describes it to me is she says on the one extreme, there's something called disease or illness. The absence of illness is what she calls health. But that doesn't mean you're okay. Health is not the end goal. Health is just the beginning of what she calls wellness, which is actually, taking yourself to your highest potential. And the way she describes it is she says, you may be free of disease, so you think, but you have no idea what toxins you're taking in your body. You have no idea what your blood sugar count is. You have no idea what your blood pressure is. And all this has a long-term effect on you that you don't see every day. And that's one day going to show up. So I'm showing you these slides because we live in landscapes that are bucolic, that are verdant, but we have no idea what the long-term implications of these are. I mean, suburbia across the world is plagued with other kinds of toxicity issues. We have freeways, for example, that connect suburbia to the places we work. So there are patterns of urbanization where you don't live and work in the same place. You have to use something else that generates toxicity and fumes and all these kind of things, which we take for granted. We think that it doesn't affect us because we don't see it, but it has gross effects on our long term, particularly the people who don't have choices like you and I do. The third one, which is something very dear to me, is the symbiotic relationship between health and environmental issues. There is now an increasing body of research that tells us that deforestation is directly related to epidemics and pandemics. So, if you think about HIV, if you think about SARS, if you think about all these things that have happened, there have been places, these happened in places that were devastated, eroded. The forest cover was completely eroded. What does this mean? Essentially, every forest is a balanced, harmonious ecosystem of animals, beasts, plants, viruses, bacteria, all of them living in complete harmony. Balance. Once you disrupt this balance, a lot of nonsense can happen. And what happens also is because animals lose their habitat, they come into human settlements. Humans go into the forest to search for food, and there is increasing contact between man and beast, which should not be happening because these beasts are supposed to live deep in the forest. So this kind of non-expected contact generates a lot of things that have happened before. The HIV virus, for example, jumped from a chimpanzee to a human being and mutated itself when people hunted the chimpanzee, and through the blood it got transfused. So there are many such episodes that are shedding light on the notion that deforestation is not just, you don't have to be alarmist about deforestation just because we're losing our forest. There's a much, much graver issue at stake, which really has to do directly with our collective health. The fourth one is the idea that the fields of public health, urban planning and architecture, were at one point diffused, and now they're divorced. This is a very interesting thing to think about it, because if you think about even as late as 1850s or 1860s, and you think of all these beautiful projects like Central Park in New York, or the Boston Necklace done by people like Frederick Law Olmsted, just mega, gigantic open spaces. These were not just aesthetic issues, they were public health subjects. Olmsted was actually a public health official, I don't know if you know this, and a landscape architect who actually proposed this idea as a public health subject. So there was a time when this diffusion was crucial. And obviously, with super specialization, they got divorced, and now we don't talk to each other anymore. And the fifth one is that we've gone through pandemics before. And pandemics have always been a catalyst for us to think about urban planning. Here are two examples. I mean, the plan down there is one of the earliest from scratch planned cities in the United States, Philadelphia. And the founder of this, William Penn, in 1682, had survived the plague of London, and the fire of London that killed the rats and therefore killed the plague. And what he did when because he had suffered and he knew he'd seen suffering all around him, he planned Philadelphia in a very sort of rational way. Between two water bodies, all the streets were sloped down all the way to the river. And it had a very simple, clear grid with lots that were very large and houses that were sitting between the lots with ample air, ample parks, 4 parks that make quadrants. So there was a very conscious effort to decongest the city and to make something that he had learned at that point had created the plague in London. The second one is Memphis, 1878, where doctors, public health officials, engineers, and planners collaborated for the first time after the pandemic, the epidemic happened there, to create a complete survey of the city to figure out where water was stagnating, what codes needed to change, and so on. My point is, we can either choose to look at the COVID-19 pandemic as a crisis, or we can choose to look at it as an opportunity to rethink, what this means for our future. So, some thoughts on some struggles and failures that we've had in practice. I think one thing the COVID-19 has done for all of us is it really does. We don't want to go too far from our homes anymore. We're afraid. Our caution radars are up. This whole idea of walking far away, driving far away, subjects us to psychological peril, at least in the lockdown times. So this is not a new idea, right? Because the notion of living close to work, the notion of having to walk to the shop where you get your daily needs, is just simple common sense that has been part of our traditional cities forever. The Industrial Revolution had to change that because you had to live far away from factories that were exuding toxic fumes. We don't live in those kind of worlds today. So one of the key ideas that I think is important to contemplate, which is nothing new, but just a return to the traditional city, is the idea of polycentric city. That you don't have one downtown, one CBD, where you have thousands of freeways that are feeding you there. You actually have a series of centers, and you live around these centers. Some of these centers are big, some of these centers are small, but each of these circles is a pedestrian shed of about 5 minutes or walking distance from the center to the edge, where you walk comfortably. So all your daily retail, all your milk, everything you need is available within walking distance. This is a science that is known. Every traditional city before the industrial era was based on these kind of ideas. It's time we think of them and amalgamate them for contemporary urbanism. So this is one major way of thinking. The inset in the slide is land use planning. I just want to remind all of you, many of you know what this means, but this is the anathema because land use planning has taken this away. So we're trying in many cities now all across the world to return this science back. But polycentricism is the starting point of thinking about urbanism before we even get into architecture. The second notion is that cities are not homogeneous. You don't design cities the same way. There are dense parts of cities, there are less dense parts of cities, there are completely less dense parts of cities. From a regional standpoint, the city is a gradient of relationships between nature and buildings. So imagine to the right-hand side, the dark buildings that you see, imagine that's Manhattan, or imagine that's the densest part of your city. Then you have what are called the exurbs, which are slightly less dense, and then you have the suburbs, and then you have the country, or whichever way you want to call it. This exists in some form or the other in absolutely every part of the world. It may not exist with the same clarity in a place like India or Latin America, but it does exist. So what this really means is that this concept of polycentricism can take various forms. You don't have to design polycentric towns and cities with the same densities. You can design very high density places that are polycentric, where everything is within walking distance, mid density, low density, depending on where you are. I also want to remind you that this notion of polycentricism has enormously beneficial impacts on a demographic that, I think most of us begin to realize as we reach our 40s and 50s, as our parents are getting older, because the elderly is a demographic that's been severely affected in the COVID-19 pandemic for obvious reasons. So when you think about intelligent planning, to talk about that demographic as much as the demographic that's underprivileged, all of this is what really planning inclusive cities is all about. Inclusive cities are about not leaving anybody out, including children, of course. So one of the things we've launched a huge campaign in other parts of the world is to repair the debacles of post-war suburbia. Post-war suburbs everywhere in the world were designed around cars. They look like this in the worst case. They have mega malls, they don't have streets. I mean, you can look at this landscape, completely inundated with cars. This is a real landscape in the US. There's no place to hang out here. You only go into an air-conditioned mall, which is completely toxic. There's a freeway that slashes through your city, fracturing the southern side of the city from the northern side. And the heart of the city is not a street, it's not a landscape where you can walk. It's an air-conditioned mall. It destroys the air, that has gigantic parking lots, there is no reuse value. Think of the minimal verdant cover there is. This is a toxic landscape in every single way. What we've tried to do is launch concerted campaigns and partnerships with the municipalities through political backing. So you cannot do this as an architect in isolation or an urban designer in isolation. You have to have collaborative planning where the leadership of the cities understand the impact these toxic landscapes are having. Now, it's also an economic incentive because what's happening is as other cities, neighboring cities, change their ways and become healthier, demographics get attracted to the healthier cities. So cities that have landscapes like this wake up and say, you know what, it's not working for us. We need to change. So they begin to change. So this is a plan, a citywide plan. It's a very ambitious citywide plan that begins to show you everything you see in light is the existing fabric that we don't touch, but everything in dark is the blueprint that allows the city to grow in the future by taking just a few areas, in this case, a new downtown, a center to the south, a corridor, and then really thinking of these from a design standpoint, along with all the greens, including the streets, that create a new park network for the street. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to leave the neighborhoods completely alone, because that's where people live, but attack these kind of landscapes and convert them into pedestrian places where you rely less on the car, more on public transit, and you create walkable places that are humane to change the nature of what this means. In the COVID-19 world, if this continues, one of the great habits that I think we've developed in the COVID-19 world is not relying on our cars for obvious reasons. We're in lockdown. But if we can live this way, particularly if we're close to work, close to where we live, remote, digital, whatever it is, if we don't rely on the car much as we have over the last few years, one great promise is to reclaim our streets. Because streets are no longer just the conduits for cars anymore. They become the most ubiquitous public spaces in the city. You can transform a street and make it, imagine all your streets as extended parks. And why would you not think of every street in your city as an extended park, right? So here is a project, a very low-income project in a low-income city in the United States, where you take a wide asphalted thoroughfare that almost looks like a COVID-19 thoroughfare. There's nobody there. And you convert it, you transform it through design where, during the weekend, during the week there could be cars, but during the weekend, it could be a beautiful place where you go, you do your no-mozo or non-motorized zones and things of this nature. The bottom line is, when you have people who back this up from a municipal standpoint, you can get these kind of projects implemented in very short periods of time. So this project was implemented in 8 months. It is a 1 mile long project, implemented in 8 months. And what is beautiful about this project is just investing, in this case, 8 or 10 or $14 million, reaps the city $300 million in 3 years, because now it becomes an economic investment strategy. So what I'm trying to point out is, we can't think of these as ideological projects. Oh, I want to green streets because it's healthy for you. Well, surely it's healthy for you. But it can also make you a tremendous return on economic investment. You can invest money in the street. You can make it a very beautiful place. You can attract real estate. What is beautiful about places like this is they become the bridge between the rich and the poor. I've always said in Goa, for example, where I'm from, the beaches of Goa, the perfect example. The moment you step on a beach, there is no rich or poor. Outside a beach, you may be rich and I may be poor. But once we're on the beach, we all find our own place and we're happy. We're sitting in the sand, we're enjoying the water. That's what happens in these places. These places become the bridges where all kinds of people come. It gives the underprivileged the same rights as the privileged. So making public space is one of the most important strategies to bridge the economic gaps across. Which leads me to another toxic landscape, the highway, of which there are plenty in all parts of the world. So here's a desert town in the US. It could be in any other part of the world. It shows the evolution of this desert town over a decade. And you can see how through policy, through wrong policy, just not progressive policy, this is what we call sprawl, where each building has its parking right around it. This is a very utopian landscape. And you can see the photograph to the bottom right, really a highway slashing through this town with large parking lots, large retail boxes, really nothing much in terms of making a healthy landscape. What we're trying to do is we're trying to attack these kinds of landscapes with the will of the city officials. And we're transforming these into what we call, foresting experiments. You forest the city. You take and make trees your best friend, landscape to the rescue. So basically, you take all these sort of so-called toxic swaths and you pour and make them the most verdant places you possibly can. In this case, you convert the highway into what we call a boulevard. I mean, all of us go to Paris. All of us love these gigantic, beautiful thoroughfares. All of us have these, even in Indian cities, they used to be there in the past. We've just forgotten about it. So why not revive this idea of making trees in the city your best friend, reforest the city? And what is beautiful about this is, if you think about what this means as economic investment, the city does the first phase, which is it invests money and forests 2 miles, in this case, of this highway. But along it, all of these empty and sort of semi-vacant or completely active parking lots can, over time, now become villages, mixed-use villages where people can live, people can work. And so the regional highway becomes a destination, not just a conduit to take cars from one city to the other, but a destination where people can live, people can work. They become beautiful places because their character is completely changed. Reclaiming freeways has become a very big campaign in the US, in Europe, many other parts of the world. Freeways are no longer being allowed to fracture our communities. This is the city I live in, Pasadena. You can see that this is a freeway that was going through the city. The original idea of a freeway was never to come into the city. Freeways were meant to connect one city to the other. They were meant to be outside the city. But there came a moment where freeways began to slash through our cities, destroying the cities, fracturing them. And basically, your community is yours, my community is mine. There is research to suggest that none of us should be living within 1 mile of a freeway. It's just toxic. The amount of toxicity in the air is not good for you. So if you're living within 1 mile of a freeway, you're in deep trouble. It can have long-term effects on your lungs. We know all this, but our policies do not support it. So this is a unique project where the citizens of Pasadena, I say this again, the citizens of Pasadena came together. We all volunteered our time, architects, engineers, whatever, economists, and we came up with a campaign that we presented to the city council of taking this freeway and actually converting it into a boulevard, keeping the traffic. There were traffic engineers who made sure that the traffic counts were legit. And then you claim all of the real estate. Freeways are large pieces of land. You can get enormous real estate value from a freeway. So again, I say this point again and again, these are not ideological projects. They are economic drivers. You have to have economic incentives. You can never expect a city to invest in a project if it's not going to get a return on investment. So when you attack a freeway, when you want to transform a highway, you have to see it as an economic strategy by placemaking, by making beautiful places for the rich and the poor, by making enduring places, by making affordable housing, by making beautiful places for everyone to live. You're not only bridging economic gaps, but you're also making money for the taxpayers of the city. Transit, there are all these totally ridiculous, funny propositions that, oh dear, COVID-19 is going to reduce mass transit. We're not going to take public transit anymore. We're going to be scared. We're going to sit in our cars. You know what? I'll say this very categorically. You and I have choices. We have a car. You can drive in a car. You don't have to, you don't have to worry about it. But I want you to know there are millions of people out there who do not have cars. Public transit is their only choice. I mean, think about this. For you and me, we're afraid to take public transit because we may catch COVID-19. But there are people out there, daily wage earners, who have to go to their work every day. They don't own cars. How are they going to get to their work? Public transit is the only choice they have. Now, there's one side of changing public transit based on the 6 feet distancing and the physical distancing and all that. That's underway. The bigger point I'm making is, as architects, there's something we can do, something big that we can do, which can be a wonderful form of justice, which is taking transit nodes in all our cities, whether they're bus stops, whether they are train stops, whatever it is, and making them incredible destinations. I mean, this is an amazing opportunity to take every transit node because you know that people are coming there. Hundreds, thousands, 20, whatever number of people, they're going to be there. They're going to be standing there to catch the train or the bus. They're going to be hanging out there. Why not invest money to bring shopping, work, living? So one of the things we've been doing on a concerted basis is taking transit nodes and making them destinations, plazas, streets, bringing housing around it. And the beautiful thing is you can actually bring affordable housing around transit. You can build significant density around train transit because it's a wonderful way that people then live right next to the stations or the bus stops, come down, take the train, and it's a disincentive to be using the car. So to the degree that we can think of architecture and urbanism, that disincentivizes the use of cars by locational intelligence, design intelligence, all of these things are the layers that our profession really has to deal with. New York, Wuhan, and Milan are the three most important cities in the world that have been affected by COVID-19. And they all have one thing in common. They are all high-rise, high-density cities. They're significant high-rise conglomerations. Now, many of you know this. When you live in a high-rise in many parts of the world, like Hong Kong or US, so on and so forth, there's central air conditioning, which means that you're breathing the same air that someone else is breathing. It's filtered and circulated, but the bottom line is there's a danger that if it's infected, you could catch that infection. So there is an alarmist stance, obviously, in high-rise living right now, because people are very concerned. They're living in airtight buildings. That's contradictory to what you're being told about COVID-19. So those who can afford it are escaping the high-rise dense cities and running away to the suburbs. Those who cannot afford it are continuing to live. This is happening in New York. This is happening in many places. It raises a very interesting question, right? Because if the lure for high-rise living or high-density living, which is actually one of the more interesting things in certain parts of the world, like Hong Kong and other places where you don't have enough land to live on, is going to be a precarious option, then the danger is we'll be making the same mistake we made years ago, which is all of us begin to be completely seduced by the lure of suburbia, and we're going to keep destroying nature outside us. So this is a proposal that reminds you, in the inset is Le Corbusier's famous Villa Radios, where he took the medieval city of Paris, which was 2 and 3 stories, and he imposed the idea of 14 cruciform skyscrapers. And the idea was very noble. We may criticize Corbusier, but the idea was noble. He was trying to criticize the congested city of Paris, which was filled with disease and everything, and trying to create this city with lots of air and what he calls the lungs of this. But we know now, 60 years later, that this is a terrible model of urban design. Terrible. I'll say it again. Corbusier was a great architect. He was a terrible planner. He didn't know anything about city design. And great architect, by the way. But there's a difference. So there are ways of designing high-rise living by amalgamating them with low-rise. So here's a model where it's a demonstration project where you can have a simple grid of blocks like Barcelona, for example. You don't have to have it this way. Bottom line is what you see in this model, which is certain avenues can take higher buildings, certain avenues can take middle buildings, and certain avenues can take. What's the advantage of this? You're not packing a homogeneous city. You're not putting everyone in high rises. Number two, you're offering market choices. Those who can afford to live in high rises will live in high rises. Those who cannot, can live in low rises. So you're creating a model of inclusive living rather than shoving everyone into one typology, which is what the Villa Radios did. And the failures of social housing all across Europe, which were based on this model, are there for us to see. We described this in our book, which we talked about Sunaparanta last year. The failure of social housing across the world came because we thought of housing as a commodity of space. We began to pack people in housing without worrying about access to jobs, access to open space, whether their children had spaces to play, how are they going to get to their work, and so on. Point is, before you think of housing, you have to think of many, many other things, like all of the issues that are the daily needs of a family. Once those are fulfilled, you can talk about housing. So inclusive housing or affordable housing doesn't mean housing itself. It's an entire menu that has to be done in that order. The best architects in India over the last generation have said what I'm going to say repeatedly. And if you look at their work, it's essentially the best work they did was essentially exemplary in terms of this idea, which is you can achieve the same density of high-rise, high-density by going low-rise, high-density. High-rise, high-density may give you tall buildings, but it also requires enormous amounts of open space between the buildings. It wastes a lot of land. You can go back to the traditional city where you can take 3, 4, 5-story buildings at most. and achieve enormous density. This is a competition we won in Los Angeles. Most of the other entries proposed 8 towers. We were the only team that proposed 3, 4, and 5-story buildings, and we achieved the same amount of units because it's a science that's very well known, particularly in our parts of the world where sustainability, indigenous architecture, all these things are enormous latent pots of wisdom. So to learn from them is actually wonderful. Corridors are not necessary in buildings. Corridors, people are getting afraid of corridors now because corridors means you're going to cross each other. Crossing each other means who knows what. There are ways of doing housing that don't have any corridors. Here's a mid-rise project we've done where the gross area to the net area, which is typically 18% difference. The corridors typically constitute 18% of your building. You cannot sell them. But in a building like this, you can sell 100% of your real estate. So it's very simple traditional housing centered around courtyards, open to sky courtyards. There's cross ventilation in every unit. All the units at the bottom enter directly from the court. All the units on the upper floors go up a stair. Very simple housing based on traditional precedents. There's the plan. Instead of designing a conventional apartment building with a stair in the middle, you now arrange these units around courtyards. All I'm trying to point out is these kind of types exist everywhere in the world. They exist before industrial era set in. All we have to do is look for the examples in our regions and think about them. And I know many of you are already doing it, so that's a wonderful. The lure for the suburbs has the danger of destroying our cities by killing nature around it. So if people living in the dense cities don't want to live there anymore and run to the suburbs, and we want to create new towns outside our cities, the science is to design them as self-sufficient neighborhoods. So this is a project in Panama where this is an analysis of a historic town, which you see, and you can see some of these random pods of development that have happened. And you can see all of the forests and greenways that exist around the town but have the danger of being destroyed. And the one in pink is the tiny little holding that our client had in this case. And what we did here is we created a self-sufficient neighborhood which doesn't rely on the city. So you don't have to drive on this dark line, black line to come into the city or do any such thing. You basically have a compact network of parks, streets. Note that the forest to the left-hand side is completely preserved. And you have, along the highway, which is converted into a forested boulevard, you have all the retail and all the office, which will sustain this town. And you have the neighborhood to the south. This project is currently breaking ground in Panama, and it'll be a model of how to design exurban communities that are based on the idea that they're self-sufficient neighborhoods. Housing doesn't have to be a series of buildings. They can become townscapes. When you start thinking of how traditional towns were made, you could still keep your 6 feet of distance from each other, but that doesn't mean that you live physically separated from each other in large estates. You can create cogent townscapes into compact neighborhoods that can be regionally, climatically responsive. So architecture can be off its place. It doesn't have to be some kind of abstract notion of some artistic expression always. It can stem from traditions of planting, of landscape, of everything that has worked in that place for so many years. It's another approach to architecture that I think we have forgotten. So the making of hamlets, the making of towns, the making of preserving nature, and locating settlements very carefully in nature is of the essence, I think, as we think of the lure of living in nature. So here are 2 projects where, particularly the one on the right, where a series of hamlets is located within forest clearings. You don't cut the forest, but you locate it very carefully where the forest is already cleared. You bring an ecologist on board. You study where the forest is young, where the forest is old. How much density can you bring to a young forest? All of these studies go into the making of what we call, these kind of sort of eco-sensitive projects. And then just to sort of leave you on a couple of final ones, there is, what really saddens me is the loss of agricultural land. It's happening in Goa, it's happening everywhere. We own all these estates, outside plantations, estates outside our cities. And the lure of real estate takes over. And we think of these places only in one way, as land that we can sell. So here's a project where what you see here is a piece of land with a lot of agriculture that existed in it. What the developer wanted to do is divide that land, kill all the agriculture, design 20 houses and sell it and make money. What we eventually convinced him to do is save the agriculture, which you see right here, and compact the houses into certain areas so that you can have the agriculture sustaining the community. Now, I'm not saying this is again ideology. This could be an incentive. This could be an economic incentive where the government can intervene. It can give you tax breaks, all kinds of things that can really keep agriculture going. So in other words, integrating agriculture and development is of the essence as we begin to think of the outskirts of us. So I'll leave you on this note. I think, COVID-19 is a tremendous incentive for us to think of what it means for architects and urban designers. What are we going to do over the next 20, 30, 50 years? And I'll go as far as to say this. In my estimation, there are two aspects that will determine our urban destiny over the next foreseeable future. The first one is the bridging of the inequity, the tremendous economic inequity that breaks us. And second, climate change. And both of them are within the purview of our profession. So if we attack these two issues and we ask ourselves, how can we as architects and urbanists attack these issues, I think we're getting somewhere. So I'll leave you with 3 points. The first one is to redefine architecture and urbanism as an environmental campaign and an activist campaign rather than an aesthetic campaign. I'll say this again and again. It disappoints me that we have reduced architecture to an aesthetic field. It is not an aesthetic field. It never was, and it was never meant to be. We judge it on the basis of style, aesthetics, our personal taste, I'm better than you, whatever. But if you go into the deeper questions of what our profession means, a whole other set of issues emerge. So I feel that rather than think of COVID-19 as a crisis, let's use it as an opportunity to rethink what urbanism means, rethink what architecture means, keep our egos aside, sit on the same table, and talk to each other about what we can do collectively. Thank you.
We'll just start with the conversation portion of this session. Now, in the past months, all our cities have been walkable because we've all been confined to our homes. They have suddenly turned unpolluted, vehicle-free, while having to maintain this 6 feet physical distance protocol. Our bike lanes are being increased, etc. We're also hearing stories of flamingos that are flocking to Bombay, jellyfish that have, returned to canals of Venice. Do you think we'll start seeing more cohesive efforts towards creating more greener cities?
Well, greener cities is a very abstract word, Leandre, but I know what you're asking. So let's take it from there. Since you mentioned flamingos and so on, it's a very good question, because one of the crises of our profession is we pretend that wildlife doesn't exist. I think that's a fantastic question. I don't remember when, I failed to see a project or, just mainstream practice where we have a concerted effort in making sure that our cities are not just for humans, but for all sort of multi-species architecture and urbanism. We think of a profession as a multi-species profession. Now, what does this mean? 2 things. I think the first one is there are 3 kinds of natures if you think about the world that we live today. That's pure nature, virgin nature, that's the forest and things we shouldn't disturb. Then there is what we call urban nature. Now, urban nature is a fascinating one. I don't know if you know this, but peregrine falcons, so one of the fastest birds in the world, are hatching in Brooklyn, in New York, or in skyscrapers in New York, because instinctively the bird likes to nest on cliffs, very high cliffs, and skyscrapers give it the ability to do so. Crows in Japan scavenge walnuts, and there's these beautiful studies where they bring the walnuts and one by one they drop them on the freeways so that the cars will crack them. And so there are in Canada, the coyote and the gray wolf have mated and created a new breed called coy wolf, which takes the best qualities of both that lurk on the freeways, escaping the city and living at the fringes of the metropolitan region. So the point I'm making is wildlife is adapting, tortured wildlife, is adapting beautifully to our cities, but it's second nature, it's a tortured nature. And the third nature is the opportunity to bring nature back into this. So everything I talked about in terms of foresting the city and so on are strategies essentially to remember that these are the first steps towards a multi-species urbanism. There's a lot of talk today, thankfully, about pollinators. Bees, as we know, are considered the most important creatures in the world. But what exactly does that mean? It means that all the lost spaces in our cities, which we take for granted, streets, sidewalks, these could be rethought just by the insertion of landscape, of thoughtful intervention by architects. We could begin to think of cities as potent places, not just for us, but for everyone else. So I very much think this is of the essence, Leandre, that the images of goats coming down from the hills in villages in Wales, cougars walking in the streets of Barcelona, all these are reminders of the degree to which wildlife has remained at the fringe of mainstream discussions on city planning. We absolutely need to bring that in post-COVID-19.
Thank you, Vinayak. That's actually a subject that's very close to my heart, wildlife and conservation especially. And we're seeing this more and more in India, where we're trying to connect rural India to urban India. And as a result of building highway systems and freeway systems, often the corridors of movement for the animals, whether it's elephants or tigers, tend to be infringed on. How would we, connect these two worlds together without infringing on the animal habitat?
Well, so I'm not an ecologist, so I have to be careful how I answer this question. I'm not an authority to tell you, answers with certainty. But I will tell you a few things I know about this, having worked with ecologists. There are a handful of such examples in the world. One of the great places to look at is the Netherlands. I encourage you to look at this place because the Netherlands, being a small country and a very intelligent country in how it's managed itself, is one of these places where ecological planning is at its cutting edge. And what they've done is first of all, there are certain areas that are absolutely out. You don't develop there at all. No matter what, you just don't touch them. You cannot, because the moment you touch them, you're destroying major ecologies. But sometimes you have to connect freeways from one place to the other. It's really your question. You have to. Now, what they've done is there's a wonderful project called the Liveable. It was a highway that had to go from one part to the other. But what they did is they conducted this extensive study of all the species that were living in that area. And they realized that most of the large predatorial species use the top. Predatorial species do not like to go under things. I mean, there are various behavior animal patterns that you cannot take for granted. You can't just say, I'm going to leave a hole for them and they're going to happily, it just doesn't work that way. So they did all this study. That's why it's so famous. And they constructed the highway in such a way that the cars go down and the highway becomes an embankment for the predatorial creatures to go up. So instead of the cars going up and the animals going down, they reversed it based on empirical evidence. And the most beautiful thing is this project has been active for the past 10, 15 years now. Every year, they monitor the behavior of the animals. This is even more interesting. It's not enough to say, I did my part, now let's hope for the best. I think the coy wolf will behave himself. It doesn't work that way. Every year they go and they document everything that is going on, and they've seen which species have gone down, which species have gone up, and they've adapted constantly. And I'm saying this with a lot of optimism because I read with a lot of fondness over Facebook and Navin Times and everything. There are people in Goa who are so knowledgeable, people in Mumbai who are so knowledgeable about all these things. There's a genuine concern for wildlife, for wilderness. I think the only problem is that they don't have the context or the conduits through which to negotiate with the architecture and planning world. They don't have the conduits to negotiate with the engineering world. So we need to create these bridges where the ecological side of the story begins to create a marriage to engineering, architecture, planning, so that we can begin to think of these disciplines as going towards a common goal.
Yes, but there's also a major challenge, at least in the metro cities here in India, of density and demand for adequate housing. How can we redefine our cities, thinking of this coexistence with our natural ecosystems?
I think I'll tell you this. It's a very simple answer. The technical solutions to all this are easy. I mean, I'm not saying they're easy, but they're easier because you can bring a bunch of intelligent professionals and they'll give you alternatives and all these things. The most important thing is political backing. Whether it is the Netherlands, whether it is the United States, whether it is India, at the end of the day, every success story that happens in transforming a city only happens for one reason, that the leadership and the political backing actually begin to realize there's something dramatically wrong. I mean, every project I showed you today would never have been possible if it was not backed by the mayor or the political leadership. So the answer is not technical. The answer is not how do we solve this problem. We can solve all these problems. The answer is, do we really have what it takes to spark off a serious enough exploration of solutions to these problems? That's number one. Number two is to get out of silos that our professions are trapped in. So as architects, instead of asking the question, what is architecture? I hate that question. What is planning? That's a kind of timid question. If you change the nature of that question, what can architecture be? What can planning be? What can health be? What instead of saying, I will define architecture this way, that's a very limited answer. You're limiting it. If we get out of our silos, and just say, you know what, I'm an architect, I have certain skills, I've studied something, but I don't know everything. I don't have the complete answer. Maybe I'll talk to an ecologist, maybe I'll talk to you, maybe I'll talk to him. So to the degree that we can facilitate collaborative planning, collaborative professionalism, I think that is the success story in all the projects we're talking about. They were never done. They were not done by me alone. I could never do these projects alone. They were done by multidisciplinary teams that came together towards a common cause backed by political leadership. So I'm also saying this because, in India, what is truly admirable is that in the wake of murky administration, not just in India, in other places too, in many parts of the world, there are other means of practice that are coming up. I mean, I have admired and I continue to admire from a distance all of the efforts that are happening in Mumbai, for example, to take care of the slums and the squatters. I mean, they are incredible organizations that are doing amazing work. Most of the architects don't even know what those practices are about. So I think it is crucial that we bring these kind of practices into the equation, talk about them, because they have answers that we don't. So the answer does not lie as a technical solution. The seed of this answer lies in political initiative.
I'm going to ask one last question from our side, but we actually have quite a lot of audience questions, which I'd rather get to. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about public health today and the way the city is changing, in that, we have technological advances to contact trace, to kind of map where people live, where's density higher. Do you think that kind of technology is going to come into city planning in a big way, especially in India when it comes to sewage, waste disposal, general organization of a city, and the city's plumbing, really?
It's a very good question again, Ishita. I'll begin by answering it this way. Stockholm right now recycles 95 to 99% of its garbage. Stockholm is a garbage-free city. It's like just practically no garbage. Why is this amazing? Because it's a very prosperous country. It's a country with very little population. So what it's done is, because it's a technologically advanced country, every house in certain neighborhoods has this system that goes underground, and it's connected to the main hub. And you have different places where you dump different kinds of garbages, and they go in and they generate energy, and the energy is returned back to the house, and all of the solar heating. I mean, it's just an impeccable system. But it works in a society where there is accountability. There's cultural accountability. In other words, people are expected to throw wet garbage in one place and dry garbage in another, and they will do it. That's just part of that society. In complex places like India, where you don't have that kind of accountability, you cannot expect that kind of accountability, neither can you expect the kind of reliability on technology. I think the great wisdom for places like India is not to loathe technology. I mean, the whole smart city criticism that people are making is, I think, only half true. I mean, sure, technology is not going to solve all our problems, but it could solve some. I mean, look what the cell phone did. It transformed the life of fisherwomen in Goa. I remember, it's amazing, and their lives became better. So if technology can help, please let it help us. But in a country, in a society where population is very different from places like Stockholm or the Netherlands, where complexity in society, cultural complexity, economic disparities, education is very, very complex, I don't think technology will be the only torchbearer to giving us a future. I think one of the most underestimated aspects of India is the indigenous wisdom that we have. And the best minds of the past two generations have constantly talked, even through their work, about how indigenous influences matter and can change the world to such a great degree. So the answer is a hybrid one. Technology is not the only answer. The answer is complex, and it is complex because our society is complex. We can never have one answer to a society that is as complex as human.
Should we start with the audience questions? The first one comes from Shweta Trivedi. Post-COVID-19 urbanism might need to become self-reliant. That is, dwellings may need to become self-sufficient, not just from a waste recycling perspective, but also from a perspective of providing sustenance. Already, many international architects are experimenting with design of buildings which grow their own daily produce. Do you think this is a possibility in Indian cities with fluctuating weather patterns, electrical grids which are not dependable, aging infrastructure, rising cost in building industry, making housing even more unaffordable for the common man?
Thank you, Shweta. That's a nice question. When I spoke about polycentric cities, what is truly fascinating about Indian cities to me is they are already polycentric, but they are polycentric in an unplanned way. I want you to understand what I'm saying here. Polycentric basically means that if you're living somewhere in a neighborhood, you can get out and you can buy your vegetables within walking distance. Okay, you walk 5 minutes, a very nice walk, you buy your vegetables and you come back. I think this happens in so many cities in India, but it doesn't happen through legal means. This is the magic of Indian cities, right? And you've got to accept it. And just think about it. You've got to go for the strengths, not the weaknesses. The strength, the magic of Indian cities is through magical means, bending, informality, whatever we want to call it. I remember my sisters live in Pune. I go there, I get out of their building. Within 2 minutes, I get everything I want. Now, when I look around, is that legal? I don't care. I don't know. But it's there. So what does this mean? This means that if we forget the Euclidean planning that came from the Western world, is the only lens through which to judge the city. This is the problem we're having. We look at Indian cities, I'm talking about India right now, we look at Indian cities only through the lens of Western mainstream planning models. So all the policies and everything we do are Western imports, land use, the zones, whatever. Not a bad thing, but it's not the only answer, right? So what is happening in a lot of Western societies is they're craving desperately the informality that India already has, right? We're trying to create farmers markets on weekends in parking lots because we're bored of going into malls. So there's a give and take everywhere. The point I'm making is if we begin to think of mechanisms, they could be bottom up, they could be top down, they could be policy, whatever you want it, whereby you can actually create places for vending, create places for vendors, create a place where organic, informal, incremental, piecemeal urbanism can be fostered, can be nurtured without creating unhygienic conditions, without making too many laborious policies. You can create a magical Indian city, in my opinion. The answer to your question for me is that the solutions don't lie in planting, put something on your roof or whatever. You want to take your building and plant some crops up there, more power to you. But I don't think that's the way to solve the problem of the Indian city. I think it's the way to solve the problem of the Indian city is to embrace the magic it already has, which is all of these people who gain their employment by doing such amazing entrepreneurial things that you and I cannot even imagine. I mean, think about this. Did you know that street food in India is more entrepreneurially profitable than any of the hotels out there? The amount of money a street vendor puts in versus the amount he gains back, if you think of the percentage, is much more profit than a businessman doing something else. So in terms of proportions, my point is there's a lot of interesting entrepreneurship going on in our streets and in the informal sector. Tap into it. I think there's a lot of answers there.
Amit Koshal, who's an architect and planner from Delhi, who asks, do you believe that this is an opportunity for the architecture and planning fraternity worldwide to unite and rally around this new way of thinking towards planning and urban design? And if so, how should this be initiated, keeping in mind the issues of climate change and the after effects of the pandemic?
Well, Amit, look, there's no doubt about the fact that one of the most amazing things COVID-19 has done is it has united us, right? At least psychologically, there's no human living on the planet that is not thinking of COVID-19. I mean, that's a wonderful phenomenon. It's united us that way. But I will say that the fact of the matter is, while we have been united psychologically, the way in which our administrators, our leaders react to COVID-19, the way our healthcare systems in our respective countries react to COVID-19, the own regional crises that we face, are also emblematic of how different we are from places. This is very important, in my opinion, to note. So while, on the intellectual level, we're all united and we talk about it and share common concerns, like climate change, different societies have different attitudes to this, not because they don't care, but because the needs of the societies are very different. So I think it's very important to recognize these differences, because while you may be united ideologically towards a goal, which will be very noble and very clear, the paths to getting there will be very different for different societies. So the other way of answering this question is, it is imperative, I think, that local wisdom triumphs over global attitudes when it comes to COVID-19. You cannot have crazy global ideas about, because they did it, we're going to do it. That's nonsense. It's never going to work. I think you know more about Delhi than me. I know more about Los Angeles than you. Does that mean that you won't be able to do something good in LA? Of course you would, but it'll take you a little more time to understand. What does this mean? It means more collaboration. I need to trust your wisdom about your place. You need to trust my wisdom on my place. Because we are immersed in local realities that are of the essence of how we navigate the daily issues. I'll say one more thing. Cities and societies across the world are different not because of the way they look, because of the way they are governed. This is a very important thing. At the end of the day, we're all governed differently. So while we may be united towards a common cause, the paths to getting there are going to be very different. So focus on the local and absolutely pragmatic ideas of how a society is really working. And what that means is that practice, what we call practice, architectural practice, urban design practice, planning practice, can be defined as the ways of finding the conduits to actually connect yourself with those administrative forces that are far above you and make decisions that people like you and me cannot make. I mean, think about it. We're only architects and urbanists. We are brought into the picture when 10 decisions are already made. So if we can work with the people above us to engage with the kind of decisions they make about the noble goals that you're talking about within the realities of your place, your society, then I think we'll get it.
Next question comes from Amruta Sawant, who asks, there are studies being done and a movement growing around how the built environment affects the mental health of users. There's also the WELL accreditation that measures structures of buildings on the overall wellness factor for users and the environment. How do you think urbanists can consider mental health while designing?
Thank you for bringing the word wellness, because wellness, gets into emotional well-being, holistic issues. I think it's a very progressive, I think very highly of that subject. It's a good thing to do. But here's what I'm going to say. This is a scalar issue. You can't look at it within the lens of one scale. So when you talk about wellness at a regional scale, it means something, right? I mean, in other words, you may be living in the most sustainable house designed by the greatest architect in the world, and you're recycling all your sewage and garbage and everything. You're doing everything. It's 100% award-winning sustainable house. Wellness, you're well, you're meditating, your life is great. But you're sitting right in the middle of sprawl, where you have to drive every day to go and get your carton of milk in the morning. So what is the point of having a sustainable house that's in an unsustainable landscape? It doesn't work. So immediately the scale has to change. You're living in a house that's sustainable. It's completely ridiculous to call it sustainable if the broader context in which it sits is not. Okay, so then you make a neighborhood sustainable. But then you realize, well, if that neighborhood's sustainable, but it's sitting within a sprawl landscape around it, it doesn't make sense either. So tackling wellness is a scalar issue. We have to tackle it at multiple scales at the same time. This is why Architects need to talk to planners. Planners need to talk to architects. There was a time when these professions were one. If you asked Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci whether he was an architect or a planner, he would say, I don't know, I'm a sculptor. They were everything in one. So this is what needs to happen. The answer to your question is we need to bring these professions together so that they can tackle the issue of wellness, not just at the scale of a dwelling, not just at the scale of a neighborhood, every scale.
One question, which is about, there's a lot of new things we can adopt, we can figure out or use, whether it's technology or building and that kind of thing. But how do we approach what already exists? And Nilima's question is, what role can architects play in re-looking at existing projects to suggest changes for adopting better living practice? So making the most of what we have and, kind of transforming that also rather than just looking towards a newer thing.
Well, if you look at existing projects, so, it's important to clarify. So existing projects means projects that are in the pipeline, like under...
I think it's both. I think development that already exists. So say if you take Panjim City,
Right.
you have everything from independent houses to high-rise buildings, colonies, gated communities. You have all of that. So it's that and maybe things which are in the pipeline as well.
Okay, very good. That's an excellent question, a very difficult question. So I talk a lot with my Goan friends about this, and I'll use Panjim as an example. It's a city I grew up in. I know the city well. I love it a lot. Panjim, Madgaon, Mapsa, all these cities in Goa have three choices fundamentally. The first choice is to do nothing. The second choice is to do some crazy utopian idea. For some magical reason, if some minister has some amazing vision of making Goa the most sustainable place in the world and he's going to change construction methods and whatever. My way to answer Nilima's question would be, I think one starting point of making a concerted approach in these cities, Panjim and others, which are not become Mumbai yet. Mumbai is a post-saturated city. Mumbai is gone beyond the deep end because your city is so complicated, I don't even know what to do about it. But Goa is not in that state. Goa is very much there. We can do a lot of good things before it's too late. I think one of the ways we could tackle these cities is to take Panjim or Madgaon and leave 90% of it business as usual. Let the city continue. Just let it, but take 10% of the city and begin to change it. If you take important plazas, important church squares, important historic areas, invest in the landscape, do all these things that we're talking about that we've done in other places. So that could be a very interesting way of tackling it. So to be specific to Nilima's question, if the projects are in parts of cities that are not very sensitive areas of great historic character or anything, I would say, you know what, hope for the best, let them enjoy their life. Life goes on. Because you got to let things go and focus on important areas like Church Square, like the plaza in Madgaon, or whatever it is. Just take these amazing areas that are so precious from every point of view and don't let them go. So imagine Goa being a pilot where the rest of India or the rest of the world, who knows, is looking at it and saying, my God, like we're doing with Bogota, Medellin, Curitiba. These are Latin American cities. They're not very different from us. Their administration, their levels of poverty and so on. But the progressive planning that they have done, all of us are looking at them. Imagine Goa becoming like this. That we do these 3 or 4 or 5 progressive projects. The whole world is looking to us saying, my God, they did something amazing.
And the last question now is from Geeta Sambrekar. With the lockdown being lifted, you find that people are getting back to business as usual. With this, how and with the haphazard approach to smart city projects, how do we get back nature to city planning? And what would be the approach?
I always say this when I'm asked about smart cities. You've got to understand the word smart city as a Roman god called Janus. It's got as 2 faces. So I think of smart city as a Janus-like construct. It's got 2 faces. One face is a political face. One face is a technical face. And the two should not be confused with each other. When you use the term smart city to catch political attention, it's a cool thing, like LEED. Remember many of the architects sitting here when LEED came, it was a big deal. Oh, LEED, leadership in environment, blah, 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 blah. It's kind of crazy, right? It's just a series of checkboxes. You can have an airtight building that's LEED gold. There are stupid things I've seen like that. So it's not a guarantee for anything. So the point I'm making is, I have no problems with smart city as a political idea. It's a catchy word. It looks good. But the idea of a smart city as a technical idea has to be really examined. So, and the way I usually describe it is like a huge spaceship. Think of a huge spaceship that's above you with all these little lights, that one of them deals with economic justice, environmental justice, social justice, this, that. Question you have to ask is, in your society, which is the plug that you can attach right away? Instead of trying to be ambitious to attach all the plugs, just take one at a time. Okay, plug it up. Can I resolve social justice in my locality? Boom. That's a way of being smart. Environmental, that's a way of being smart. So what I'm trying to say is, you don't have to jump to environmental issues if it's extremely difficult to get there. So that's answer number one. You can start with social upliftment because it has implications on the environment. If you make the lives of the underprivileged better, that's already better for the environment because for obvious reasons, they don't have to spread, living in cities, all good. The more direct answer to your question is, how do you bring back nature into cities? I think the most important thing that we can do is some of these things that I showed you. Do the dumbest, simplest things that you can ever think about. Plant trees. I mean, I can't say this enough. It sounds like a cliche, but I cannot say it enough. I mean, if you think of the dumbest thing we did in most of these projects, we just planted trees. I mean, you take an area which doesn't have trees, you just plant it. I mean, a tree is the most wonderful thing there is on earth. It doesn't ask you for anything. You have to give it a little water here and there. We don't even have to do that in India. This is what frustrates me about places like Panama in India, is we are blessed with monsoons. I mean, think of how nonsensical this is, right? In Panama, it rains for 9 months of the year. In Goa, it rains for 6 months of the year. In Mumbai, it rains for 6 months of the year. All you have to do is, damn it, man, plant a damn seed. I mean, think about it. You don't even have to water it. It will grow. There is no excuse for an Indian city to not be environmentally hot. Hot in the sense, environmentally burdened. We are blessed with water. We are blessed with a climate that is tropical. There is absolutely no reason to not think of our cities in tropical ways. But instead, we don't think of it that way, and that's the problem. So forget the complex answers. Forget, I can give you more complicated answers, but the dumbest thing that you can do tomorrow is go and find a way to make friends with your political leaders, convince them that this is good for them, and get permission to plant the heck out of your city and plant as many trees as you can. And if you can do that, call me because I'll congratulate you in person.
Thank you so much for that and for leaving us with an actionable goal that all of us can actually maybe go out and plant something, plant a tree in one way or another. The monsoon's just about started in Goa. We can all find a way to make it a bit easier. Thank you, Vinayak, for joining us. Thank you, everyone who joined us. And we hope to see you next week. Thank you very much.